We have just finished transferring the PM 2.5 data from the import table to the verification table, and now we are in the third form in the series and the final form in the series, where we are going to do the initial data review of our PM 2.5 data, and then we are going to archive the data. So I begin with step K, which is to assign the pollutant and the concentration units. So you'll notice that the toolbox already assigned the pollutant, and I need to select the concentration units. And according to my database logbook, for PM 2.5, the concentration units are micrograms per meter cubed. So I am going to go ahead and click on that. And then I'm going to click on the Update Selected Pollutants and Units button. And that tells me I'm going to run an update query. So I click yes. And I'm going to update 334 rows, which is good because that matches what's in my database logbook for this file. So I click yes. And now I am ready to move on to the initial review phase, which is phase L, and is represented in the middle of the form. So first we're going to do some concentration analysis, and since I have not yet imported AQS sampling methodology into the toolbox uses a default minimum of the most common MDL from available PM 2.5 methodologies, and it uses a value of -10. So I did some research on my sampler, and the federal MDL value for my particular sampler is 2 micrograms per meters cubed. I'm going to change that from -10 to 2. And remember, once I close this form, that goes back to the default. So the next time I import PM 2.5 data, I need to change that to 2 again if I want to use that value instead of the default of -10. I also want to change my absolute maximum from 999 to a value that is more relevant to my data. And I researched the absolute maximum value for my sampler, and that value is 975. So I'm going to go ahead and change that by highlighting this 999 and typing over it. So after adjusting the range to my liking, I'm going to click on the display data outside of this concentration range button and see if anything comes up. So I actually have 39 records that are outside of the concentration range. So I'm going to have the toolbox flag those records so I can review them in the final data review process step of the toolbox. So I'm going to close this query by clicking on the lower X, and then I'm going to click on the Qualify These Monitoring Data button, and that tells me that I'm qualifying the data, I'm not invalidating the data, and it reminds me to complete the final data validation step if I want to exclude the data from AQS. So I click OK, and it says I'm going to run an update query. So I click yes, and it says I'm updating 39 rows. So I click yes again, and I record in my database logbook that I flagged 39 records. Next, I move on to the consecutive measurement difference flag, and I am going to leave the default value that the toolbox has assigned of 30 micrograms per meters cubed, and see if there are any data that get flagged based on this consecutive measurement difference. So I'm going to click on the Qualify Data Greater Than This Difference button, and I get the message box about running an update query. And it says I'm going to update 4 rows. So there were 4 rows that had consecutive measurement differences of greater than 30 micrograms per meters cubed. So I click yes to go ahead and flag those. And I record in my database logbook that I flagged 4 records due to consecutive measurement differences of more than 30 micrograms per meters cubed. So the default value for the consecutive measurement difference is set by the toolbox as 3 times the default minimum of the reasonable value range. Since I changed the minimum value range from -10 to 2, I want to try changing the consecutive measurement difference from 30 to 6. Let's see what happens when I do that. Because remember, I'm just flagging data. I'm not invalidating it. So let's try changing this to 6, because that's 3 times this value, and running this again. So I'm going to run this again by clicking on it, and it tells me I'm going to run an update query. I select yes. And this time I'm going to update 22 rows. So I record in my database logbook that I'm going to flag 22 records due to consecutive measurement differences of more than 6 micrograms per meters cubed, and I click on the yes button. So now I can move to the next sub-step in the flagging data, and that's step L2, and that allows me to assign flags based on any QC checks that might have been failing. And looking at this data, there's no qualifiers in the 2 QC checks that surround my data, so that's fine. So there's nothing I need to flag based on my QC checks. So I can go ahead and skip this step because I don't need to flag any of my data based on my QC checks. The next sub-step in the flagging series allows me to assign flags based on external information, such as auto reports or field logbooks. And for this sampling period, I do have some notes written in my field logbook that says there was a tape error that seemed to have started on January 7th around 2 a.m. and it wasn't corrected until January 10th at 7 a.m. according to my logbook that I take out into the field with me. So I would like to flag data between 1/7/2015 at 2 a.m. and 1/10/2015 at 6 a.m. So to do that, I click on the down pointing arrow in the first date range box. Now the way this drop-down box works is that I can start typing out the date, and that will bring up those dates around it in the list so that I don't have to scroll through all of the data to get to that particular date. So I'm going to begin by typing out 1/7. See, and that moves it to the 1/7, and so I don't have to scroll through all of those other dates and times. So I select 1/7 at 2 a.m. Now that's easy to get to. I don't have to scroll to it. And then I click on the drop down arrow for the end date. I began typing 1/10, and that takes me to 1/10, and now I can easily scroll to 1/10 at 6 a.m. to select it. And now if I click on the display data within this date time range, I can look at the data before I flag it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and that brings up only the records within this range. It's interesting to see the value of 5 micrograms meters cubed repeated for many hours. And when you have consecutive measurements of the same concentration value for many hours, that could indicate an error in your data. And in this example, we know it's an error because it's recorded as such in the field logbook. So if I use the vertical scroll bar, I can see how long these 5s continue. And I see that eventually it goes from 5 to 985. And 985 is an error. So when I see 985, I know from my sampler manual that that's an error flag. I also noticed that some of this data has already been flagged, and the HD30 and the HD6 flags are the consecutive measurement difference flags. The HD30 indicates that the difference between consecutive measurements is more than 30 micrograms per meters cubed, while the HD6 indicates that the difference between consecutive measurements is more than 6 micrograms per meters cubed. And the R flag indicates the out of range concentration values. So for the 985 values, that was out of the concentration range we set in the toolbox. If you need to see a complete list of the toolbox flags, the last page of the SOP for final data review and invalidation contains that list. And note, like right here, that some of these values have multiple flags, and that's totally okay. You can have multiple flags in the toolbox. I am going to flag this entire data set because obviously something went wrong here, and according to our field logbook, there was a tape error. So I'm going to flag this entire data set. So the first thing I do is I note in my database logbook that I'm going to qualify data from 1/7/2015 at 2 a.m. through 1/10/2015 at 6 a.m. And that is a total of 77 records, and I can see that from the bottom left corner of the screen. There are 77 records in this range. So I'm going to close this query by clicking on the lower X button. And then I'm going to go ahead and have the toolbox flag these data for me. So I click on the Qualify Monitoring Data within this date time range button. And it says, okay, I'm qualifying the data. Just so you know, I'm not invalidating it. And I say, okay. And it says I'm running an update query. I say yes. And it says 77 rows. Yes, that's what I want. So I click yes. And now I have flagged those 77 records. So now that I've finished the flagging process, I can move on to the transfer from data verification to the archive table process. So the first thing I want to do is check the data in the verification table. So I click on the Inspect Data Verification Table button. And you'll notice that most of the fields have now been filled in. If I scroll to the right, you'll see a bunch of fields that have not been filled in because those are the meteorological data fields, and we are not importing met data right now, so those are left blank. The year and the Julian date field are also left blank because our data were not in the serial date format. So I click on the scroll button to make sure this is correct and looks good and ready to archive, and everything looks good to me. I don't see anything strange or any blank rows, and I am confident that I can archive this data. So I'm going to click on the lower X to close the window. So I click on the Transfer from Data Verification to Archive table to copy the data into their permanent home in the archive table. So I get a message box about running an append query. I click yes on that, and it says I'm going to append 334 rows, which is what I want because that matches the number in the database logbook for this file. I click yes, and now I'm going to inspect the archive table. And remember that the archive table includes all of the data you have imported into the toolbox for your continuous pollutant samplers. So at first I see my ozone data, and if I scroll down, I will find my PM 2.5 data. So here's my PM 2.5 data and my ozone data. It all looks fine to me. So I click on the X button to close the archive table. Now that the data have been archived, I can remove the data from the verification table and delete the data import table. Remember, you always need to remove the data from the data verification table and delete the data import table every time you archive the data, because that gets you ready for your next import. So I'm going to click on the Clear Data Verification Table button, and it says I'm going to run a delete query. That's fine since I've archived the data already. And 334 rows matches what's in my logbook for this file, so I click yes. Now I have three options. I can close forms and clear data import table. I can enter metadata or other pollutant concentration from the same text file, or I can enter metadata or other pollutant concentrations data from a different text file. Since I'm done with my imports for now, I'm ready to take a lunch, I'm going to go ahead and click on the Close Forms and Clear Data Import Table button. And this will close all of the data import forms and get rid of the data import table. So it says this step is going to delete the data import table, and that's fine because I've already archived the data, so I click OK. And now I'm back on the continuous and metadata fast track form. And since I'm done working with the toolbox for now, I click on the exit form button. And now I need to close the toolbox, so I click on the top X button, and that will close the toolbox. Now, the one last thing I need to do outside of the toolbox is delete the new import.txt file from the Tribal Data Toolbox version 3.0 folder. So I select it by clicking on it and making sure that I am on the new import.txt file and it is highlighted. I click the delete key on my keyboard, and now that file has been deleted. Okay, so your homework is to use the continuous data SOP as your guide and import one of the continuous pollutant toolbox ready files you worked on as part of the previous homework exercise. Email the instructors a screen capture of the screen that opens when you click on the Inspect Data Archive Table button after you have archived the data.